Good afternoon. It's a treat to be here to introduce the Jesuit School Network's second annual Ignatian Inquiry After School Virtual Symposium. I am Kristin Cully, and I serve as Director of Inquiry and New Ventures with the JSN's Conference Office team. This is my 24th year in Jesuit education, and prior to the JSN, I was principal of Loyola School in New York City, assistant principal of Regis High School, also in New York, and a department chair, counselor, and teacher along the way. For each of these years, in every role I have been privileged to hold, I have studied and researched teaching and learning in our schools. I know this will be an informative and inspiring conversation on the many complexities surrounding what academic excellence looks like in light of the changing needs of students in our Jesuit schools at this moment in time. Like so many of you watching, my career in Jesuit education has shaped who I am as a person and as a professional, and it is my great privilege to lead this symposium on academic rigor in Jesuit education. As we get going, I would ask you to please remember to keep your microphone muted, and please know that this session is being recorded. I'd like to thank my colleague on our JSN Conference Office team, Kristin Smith, who leads all things communication for us, and for her assistance today in hosting what we aim to be a seamless Zoom program. This is the largest virtual event we have embarked on, and we are always learning as we go. I know that you can all appreciate this. Let's begin this afternoon's symposium with some context. A quick search of the definition of rigor reveals words such as severity, strictness, exactness, rigidity, inflexibility. In our field of education, we might use the word more broadly to describe learning experiences that are academically and intellectually challenging. In the conversation surrounding the creation of a new course, for example, we might ask, is this class sufficiently rigorous for our school? Or after a curriculum review, we might reflect, the content in the junior year should be more uniformly rigorous in our department, or perhaps we need to increase the rigor of assessments next year. Rigor comes from the Latin word for stiffness or toughness. We most commonly hear the word as it pertains to the difficulty of a task or a process. We might use the term when describing student workload or the so-called grind of an academic program. We might tell students in advising them on course selection, for example, that they need to pick a more rigorous schedule of classes. With our traditions of academic excellence, overflowing course loads and late-night homework routines are often viewed as a sign of commitment to rigor. It can be reasonable to infer that the term means to pile on the work or to make assignments more difficult. Yet, we can often think that for an academic pursuit to be good, it has to be hard. Yet we also know that a focus on rigor means to challenge students to think in new and interesting ways. With this lens, rigor is not reflected in more work or being difficult. Rather, rigor is relevant, challenging, deep understanding. So there is a lot to unpack in our own interpretations of the concept of rigor that will frame our conversations. As of today, April 17th, 2023, for the past 3 years since the start of the COVID pandemic, schools have adjusted to the changing needs of students in rapidly changing ways. In the beginning, it was shifting to the virtual space in our classes and to the resulting disruptions of our modes of instruction and assessment, and even to the relationship building that is at the heart of our particular way of education. As we have slowly emerged from the many changes of the past few years, educators are now called to continue to shift and adjust to the needs of students in our care by meeting them where they are. at this moment in time. So where are they? We know that of particular concern to school leaders and educators right now is the ongoing mental health crisis that we are immersed in as it relates to the many layered crises of the past few years. This was a key theme of our annual gathering of principals across the network this past November. And this symposium is a response to the work the principals did in those days together and the issues they were naming. Student mental health is of keen significance to all of our work in these challenging days, even beyond the acute mental health student cases. So many educators are balancing right now how to care for the average everyday kid who has never really struggled before, who may be quietly or not so quietly struggling in his or her own way. Students' needs are changing, and we know Jesuit schools are experiencing this as the results of our recent pop-up survey on how we listen to students' attests, and as our current pop-up survey on this concept of academic rigor in our schools will explore. All of us at this symposium are accompanying students in different ways, journeying with our youth across the 89 schools of the JSN, attentive to their evolving needs. Years ago, topics like connection and belonging may have been the purview of only mental health professionals, but in today's world of schooling, right now, nearly every teacher, staff member, and administrator is called on to care for students in these formative ways. Add this to the so-called learning gaps that are very real from lost time over the pandemic, and educators are facing a truly unprecedented time in our profession. Schools are balancing caring for the well-being of students with upholding expectations of academic rigor from every angle, including our own expectations of the learning we foster, the traditions in our school communities, parents, college admissions, the pressures of an achievement culture, and so much more. Today's conversation will allow us to consider what messages do our institutions send through our expectations, our routines, our ways of being. We know we don't just want students to survive Jesuit education, we want them to thrive in Jesuit education. Balancing rigor and care, we are at a complex moment in our schools. The world around us has changed, and it begs the question, are we changing with it? Before we begin our panel, let's open our symposium with a prayer. And if we might quiet ourselves and be reminded that in being together this afternoon, we are in the presence of God. In the name of the Father, and Son, and Holy Spirit. Let's pray for all those communities and families who are struggling, especially with loss. I've chosen a familiar and favorite reading of so many of us from Pierre Teilhard de Chardin that feels fitting for opening such a big conversation. Above all, trust in the slow work of God. We are quite naturally impatient in everything, to reach the end without delay. We should like to skip the intermediate stages. We are impatient of being on the way to something unknown, something new. And yet it is the law of all progress that it is made by passing through some stages of instability, and that it may take a very long time. And so I think it is with you. Your ideas mature gradually. Let them grow. Let them shape themselves without undue haste. Don't try to force them on, as though you could be today what time. That is to say, grace and circumstance acting on your own goodwill will make of you tomorrow. Only God could say what this new spirit gradually forming within you will be. Give our Lord the benefit of believing that his hand is leading you, and accept the anxiety of feeling yourself in suspense and incomplete. Saint Ignatius, pray for us. In the name of the Father, and Son, and Holy Spirit. As you know, the JSN seeks to be a supportive resource to our schools, and this virtual symposium is designed to be just that, a carved out space to listen, to learn, to be curious, and to engage with colleagues across North America. We are eager to encourage a spirit of inquiry across the many layers of our work in Jesuit education, and we envision our particular brand of Ignatian inquiry to be the art of inquiry as seen through our Ignatian lens, asking questions and exploring issues that matter in our schools through the frame of our shared Jesuit mission. We have over 2 hours together this afternoon, and at the conclusion, the recorded session will be shared widely via our website and social media platforms. If you are joining us live after school on this Monday afternoon or watching the recorded session on your own at a later time, we thank you for taking the time to be here. Your presence and interest in this symposium is testament to the fact that we are leading here an important and timely conversation to the health of our schools and to the well-being of the educators and students in them. We have heard that groups of faculty are gathered together in a number of schools engaging with the symposium, and we think this is awesome. So we thank you all for being here. In building our panel of presenters, we imagine that the content of our time together will serve to inform, to affirm, to transform, perhaps to challenge, and also inspire each of us as we navigate the unusual time we find ourselves in. We welcome 6 panelists who will share about the historical perspective of academic excellence in Jesuit education, about preparing students for the future by creating space for well-being and belonging, about the shifting perspectives of competitive university admissions, and finally about how we may seek to effectively balance academic rigor with changing student needs in Jesuit schools today. It is sure to be a packed and informative afternoon together. The gift of the virtual stage means that our panelists join us from Boston, Palo Alto, Brooklyn, the Bronx, Cleveland, and San Francisco. How great is that? We will benefit from the experience of educators working at Boston College, Stanford University, Brooklyn Jesuit Prep, Fordham University, St. Ignatius High School in Cleveland, and St. Ignatius College Preparatory in San Francisco. Also note that our participants in this symposium, all of you on this Zoom, hail from every corner of every province across North America. Our program allows for our 6 speakers to each share for about 15 to 20 minutes each, and 2 of them are fellow Ignatian educators who will offer real-time reflections on the remarks of the panelists that came before them. I'll be the moderator among us and be sure to offer full introductions to each speaker as we go. We will save room for a dialogue period at the conclusion. And as we get going, please feel free to use the chat window to pose questions and reactions, which we will do our best to respond to at the conclusion. With appreciation of the complexities of crafting space for students to grow and mature amid the days we live in, let's consider together, what does academic excellence look like in light of the changing needs of students in our Jesuit schools? Without further ado, I am pleased to formally introduce our first panelist. Dr. Cristiano Casalini is an associate professor, chair in Jesuit Pedagogy and Educational History, and a research scholar with the Institute for Advanced Studies at Boston College. He teaches history of Jesuit pedagogy, social justice in Jesuit context, and the educational conversation. Dr. Casalini's field of research is the history of early modern education and especially Jesuit pedagogy. He has worked on critical texts and commentaries of 16th and 17th century classics of education, especially in and around the Jesuit order. He is currently working on editing educational writings and documents as produced by Jesuits during the early modern period. He recently published Maestros Ibéricos y Pedagogia Jesuita, edited a collective volume on Jesuit philosophy, and provided with Claude Pavor the first volume of a series devoted to the history of Jesuit pedagogy entitled Jesuit Pedagogy, a Reader, 1540 to 1616. Dr. Casalini serves as editor-in-chief of the series published by Brill on history of early modern educational thought. This afternoon, Dr. Casalini will explore the historical understanding of the concept of rigor when applied to early Jesuit education, offering a historical lens to understanding the formative process that has been the key to the long-standing success of Jesuit schools. His session is entitled The Modern Day Concept of Rigor. Was it always a focus in Jesuit schools? A historical perspective of academic excellence on Jesuit education. Dr. Casalini, thank you for being here.
Thank you, Kristin. Let me try to share my screen now and see what happens. There we go. Is that okay? Yes. All right. Kristin, thank you so much for the invitation. Thank you for your introduction. Actually, you spoiled a lot of what I was trying to cover this afternoon. I believe that two major meanings resonate with people when dealing with the expression academic rigor today. One is the meaning that comes with ordinary language. So what our students, our families, prospective students of our schools or universities assign to this concept when hearing this academic rigor, and it has to do with challenging curriculum, demanding educational process, also a strict and possibly even severe grading or assessment process. In a word, more effort and possibly even a performance-oriented kind of educational path they are going to have. In a word, it's a promise or even the warning that education for our students won't come easy within our schools and universities. Then, of course, there is also another meaning that we specialists in the field of education, curriculum designers, scholars in the School of Education in university have crafted in the recent years, precisely to adjust and update that concept of rigor you were also precisely mentioning. So today, in this niche, we understand academic rigor as something that wants to solicit creativity, critical thinking for our students, and all sorts of meaningful appropriation of the content and skills that we want to convey with our own education. But this second definition really requires an explanation to be understood by the broader public. So I would assume that the first meaning is normally what we understand with rigor still today. And it makes sense because especially in this context, in the American context, possibly in the Anglophone world also, when the free market of schooling is up and running, every schools and every university competes with one another in order to attract students and families. And so the promise of having a rigorous curriculum, a rigorous practice is also associated with the fact that through that curriculum, our students will make it to the best colleges and universities, and from colleges and universities, they get the best jobs. When we hear this expression, though, in Jesuit environments, and I hear it a lot, I understand that sometimes this concept of rigor is associated with an historical image of the Society of Jesus itself. So the pedagogy model of the society has been successful over the centuries this means that the practice and the pedagogy was particularly instrumental to foster excellence, right? To foster performance from students. Sometimes I hear this concept even associated with what I would say is a misunderstanding of a core value of Jesuit education today, the concept of magis, right? Sometimes people connect this to the idea of more effort, whereas it is the greater good, right, of people. Certainly when our schools, Jesuit schools and universities, we as educators in Jesuit environment project this idea of academic rigor, today we feel it in a sort of a tension with another core value of Jesuit culture in general, a core value that has emerged in the last few decades and relates to the promotion of justice, to the preferential option for the poor. In general, all those values and ideas that project an idea of inclusivity that is required from our schools and our educational institutions. Not to say also about the care of the person, right? The concept of cura personalis, and therefore also the concept of well-being, and what today has been called recently the social-emotional learning of the process. So we feel this as like there is a value connected to academic rigor that calls for some sort of an idea of exclusivity, some sort of an idea of elite making, some sort of idea of performance-driven education. And on the other side, we have the inclusivity, the socialization, the equality, the well-being of our students. And we feel this in a sort of a dialectic between one another. So when you proposed me this topic for my talk, as an historian, I asked myself, I reflected upon the history of Jesuit education, and I asked myself, was it always the case in Jesuit education? Was academic rigor a goal or even a primary goal in early Jesuit education? As you said, you emphasized the early modern, right, field of my research. And how did rigor look like in these early years? So what I want to do today is just offer you 4 sources that from the 16th century that might help to respond to this question, and sources that project for us an image of academic rigor that, in my opinion, was definitely not in conflict or contrast with the idea of inclusivity and well-being that I mentioned before. Certainly, these sources show that the academic rigor was not that is intended from by the first definition that I mentioned, was not the primary goal of school, was not the primary method in schools, was not the primary context or setting in Jesuit schools, and it was not meant primarily for students. It was not demanding for students in as much as it was demanding for educators and the administrators of school and universities. Does this mean that Jesuit education was not rigorous? Not at all. But academic success, academic performance and excellence was the final goal, the final, the final outcome, the final product, among many others, of an environment, a positive environment that was meant to be as fully dedicated to the formative education of the whole person of students. Certainly, the academic performance is part of it, but not it doesn't encompass it all. So such a dedication, such a full dedication was unheard of in the 16th century. And in many ways, I believe that this was, in fact, the key of the success of Jesuit schools. This dedication, this care for the whole person of students was what I propose to understand today was rigorous. So these sources are, as I said, show, first of all, that Jesuit education was not intended primarily as to pursue academic excellence. The first document is a letter from Ignatius of Loyola and Juan Alfonso de Polanco, And it deals with the society's involvement with studies. It's 1551. You need to remember that the first college, the first school open to students run by Jesuits opened in Messina in 1548. So just after 3 years, Ignatius himself and his secretary, the secretary of the order, Juan Alfonso de Polanco, were reflecting upon the benefits of undertaking this new ministry for the Society of Jesus, the ministry of educating. Why should we go for schools? Why should we teach students? What are the benefits that we provide for the common good? So they listed 3 groups of people, basically, that could benefit from undertaking this, the ministry of schooling. One group was the young members of the order, so the so-called scholastics, who were in fact those who were called also to teach the lower courses, grammar, humanities, and rhetoric, in those schools. And the second one was the students, the external students of the schools that the Jesuits ran, and finally the communities around these schools. So if we go and read the list of goals and the benefits and advantages for the schools, we can read a pattern of that recurs regularly every time the Jesuits open schools. They ask themselves, are we pursuing this by opening the schools? Are we posing ourselves this primary goal? So if you see it, this primary goal is directing the studies, or directing the education of youth to the service of God. I believe this is an important piece, an important component, because it reminds us that the goal of our schools are not academic per se, they are not studies per se, but the goals are outside it. They are outside education. So we need to think that the Jesuits in the early years were thinking about providing a service to God by undertaking this ministry. The second element, most important, is those schools that the Jesuits opened were for free. So many times we hear about Jesuit education that it was elitist. When we think about the past of Jesuit education, we think that the Jesuits were training the wealthy, the nobles, and that is partly true. But the reality is that when they started to open schools, they were looking for the largest number of students. They were looking for everybody. And therefore, they were looking for an education that was free for all. It was inclusive, materially inclusive for everybody. A great philosopher, René Descartes, who was a student of the Jesuits, writing to a friend of his in the 17th century and remembering him about his experience attending a Jesuit college, emphasized the fact that one of the merits of these schools were that within those schools, everybody was treated equally, which is something remarkable in the 17th century. The 3 major domains that we see every time in these sources when connected to the pursuit of Jesuit education are always character and virtue education, spiritual formation, and certainly also academic performance, studies, right? But we need to understand that these studies are encompassed included within whole holistic process of education that we can see here in these 3 quotes that are encapsulating within other major values that Jesuit schools were pursuing, probably more important than the academic learning per se. So the Jesuits wanted to educate people to be virtuous in their entire life. And they wanted to boost students' spiritual formation, religious formation, to seek God for their entire life, and of course to seek God for their eternal salvation. And thirdly, we see that there was an important component that was played by studies, right? We see here they are given a quite adequate grounding in letters to great care by means of classes, debates, and composition. But the great care and these studies were not the primary goal. They were a part of a broader picture. So if these were the advantages for students, let's see what happens for the communities. Why are we opening school? Well, first of all, we are opening school because the families will be moved to improve their spirituality and religion by the example of their children. So there is, again, a virtue, a spiritual component to the education. They are not emphasizing the learned students that they are sending back home. They are emphasizing the virtuous persons that they are sending back. The second thing is the people of the country have in our mind people to inspire and to undertake charitable works. So the school is a model where Jesuits operate, where educators are of great example for society to improve charity, to improve the well-being and the common good of their own societies. And finally, this is a most famous part of this quote. Among those who are present at present students today, various persons will in time emerge, some for preaching, some for the care of souls. So basically we are forming leaders, but leaders that will turn into others. Their good formation in life and learning will benefit many others, with the fruit expanding more widely every day. So here the emphasis goes to good formation in life and learning. But again, there is a great emphasis on virtues and the formation of good people for the common good, rather than for learned people and great achievers in academic environments. So, what's happening here? I said before, it was not the primary goal, it was not the primary method. Here we have a document that is possibly the least known, but probably the only one, well, among the few ones that Ignatius of Loyola himself wrote about pedagogy. So we are, of course, today we know we are exposed to the concept of Ignatian pedagogy, but we know that Ignatian pedagogy is based upon the spiritual exercises and the spiritual formation of Ignatius. When it comes to the concrete pedagogy in the classroom, this is the only document so far that we know that Ignatius forged with his own hands. Teaching composition, 1544, a principal writes back to Ignatius seeking for his advice and asks him, hey, look, I'm sending to you some themes, some compositions, some tests that I have run here in my schools with my students, and look, they are so bad. Can I start to correct them according to the most prestigious, rigorous system and method that we know nowadays, which is the humanist method, Erasmus's method? Right? So he is seeking for permission to adopt a rigorous standard in correcting this composition. Let's see what Ignatius replies to him. Although the meticulous method you propose in your letter for correcting composition sounds good, if it could be done, it does not seem possible with large numbers. This is very important for the history of Jesuit education. Ignatius was a pragmatic person. And here it demonstrates that the schools were inclusive and wide open. While the humanists could do rigorous education, rigorous correction, rigorous assessment and grading, because they had few students, the primary goal of the Jesuit schools and education was to reach the many. They were, the 16th century had no public schooling, had no public education. So the Jesuits were basically among the first to introduce a large-scale education that called for a more pragmatic attitude toward correcting, assessing, grading, and evaluating students. So Ignatius said this method, this of the most rigorous method that in our times, that of Erasmus, should be praised and should be adopted only when it is possible. but it was not possible for these students. Humanists had 5 to 10 students each one. A Jesuit teacher could manage a class of 60 to 100 students. So think about ourselves today, right? In our classes, we have to manage 60 to 100. That was pretty difficult. And unfortunately, I spoiled already with this button, the final quote. Ignatius was also a man of irony, and he says, well, this is an answer like it could be the principal or the president of our school replying to a teacher, say, okay, in any case, I took a look at the themes that you sent, and well, there are quite few mistakes. So it's better than we train them better. So no primary goal, no primary methods, and let's see what happens with the context and settings. Here we have an extremely important document that is called the Constitutions for the German College, an important institution in Rome, 1570. Giuseppe Cortesono, he listed in 7 chapters what were the goals and the rules that had to be followed in that college in order to have the college thrive and students thrive. It is important to say that there was a chapter for studies, true, a chapter for fostering spiritual formation, true, but 2 central chapters. And again, we are in the 16th century, something that is unheard of at that time. 2 central chapters deal with something that is quite modern and connected less with academic rigor and academic excellence rather than well-being and whole person education. One chapter is about how to keep the college healthy. Students should live in good rooms. They should eat good food. That for an Italian like me, it should be the primary goal of our schools, even today. They should be kept out of the night air, not too much cold, right? But also they should be tempered. Studies should be tempered by recreations. So the Jesuits were the one that introduced recess. They introduced recreation. They introduced what we call today residential life, recreational activities in our schools and universities. Academic rigor was already balanced with the idea that it couldn't be pursued if the well-being first of our students was not to be pursued. I have 2 minutes, if you can give it, Kristin, and then we close it. All right. In those rules, there is stated again in the 16th century, so before modern psychology, right, that the student should take half an hour of break every 2 hours of study, because otherwise their minds couldn't work on. They should take 7 to 8 hours of sleep mandatorily every night, not staying awakened to study, because that was too much effort, and this would be to the detriment of their well-being. The other chapter that I wanted you to point this out to you was how to keep the college happy. And when we read that, is the first manner of proceeding adopted by the superiors, who act with loving kindness in such a way that students are well satisfied with it, especially the virtuous one. But second, this is the answer about academic rigor, right? When the college is happy, when the college is doing well, and no strictness and austerity are constraining it. So I will skip a little bit on this, on the rest, because I'm running out of time. Let me go with the final aspect. I said it was not the primary goal, not the primary method, not the primary context and setting, and academic rigor was not required and meant primarily for students. It was rigorous for educators. So to become an educator, a teacher in a Jesuit school, you should have been much more than an instructor, much more than a grading machine, much more than a scholar. Itself. They were among the first who put so much added value to the care and pedagogy and the art of educating. Here we have Bennett Pereira, one of the most important scholars of the Collegio Romano in the 16th century, suggesting the best practice in humanistic studies, 1564. He described to the general how should the a rigorous teacher, a rigorous for the tradition, look like in order to be a good educator for our school today. He makes this statement that we can see in every kind of document that the Jesuits wrote in this period. I would prefer that the teacher have less learning than diligence. I would prefer some lack of precise knowledge to a lack of interest and care in moving his students forward in their education. Moving their students forward in their education means a holistic vision of their education. It's not about grades, it's not about academic excellence alone. It deals with the formation of the person. As he makes it clear in my most favorite and hyper quoted passage of this letter. So I see that some students of mine are in this call. So pardon, you already know it very well. Pereira says something that is so modern, so great, so inspiring for us teachers and educators today. The teacher should be the sort of person whom the student trusts because of his learning and ability to exercise, understands because of his skillful fluency in teaching, loves for his enthusiasm and diligence, respect for the integrity of life, and when the occasion arises, feel he can approach freely for advice because of his humanity and personal warmth. Now, to me as an educator, this statement calls me to challenge myself. It means that this is rigorous for me as a person, to be of example, of personal warmth, to be so human, to care about our students beyond the academic excellence that we pursue in our school. So, for reassessing our meaning of academic rigor in Jesuit school today, let's get back and keep caring for our students, keep caring for our institution, keep caring as the early Jesuits did for the education of their old person. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cristiano. The opportunity to open our symposium by learning from you a bit on the primer of the history of Jesuit education. I think it speaks to what so many of us on the call really cherish about our work, and that are the tradition and the legacy that's so long-standing before us. So thinking about some of the parts that resonated so deeply, I would imagine with many, under the question of was rigor a goal of early education? You know, thinking about that great care of studies was not the primary goal of the early educators, but that was a part of the broader ideals, and the sense that even terms of such as balance and sleep and breaks were a part of these early works. It's remarkable, and the call to all of us as educators that we are so much more than instructors and scholars in our fields, but we are really called to care for students in really immeasurable ways. So that this idea of good formation in life, in learning, it's a terrific kickoff to our conversation today. So we thank you very much, Dr. Casalini. I'm so pleased to introduce our next panelist. Dr. Denise Pope is a senior lecturer at the Stanford University Graduate School of Education, where she specializes in student engagement, curriculum studies, qualitative research methods, and service learning. She is co-founder of Challenge Success, a school reform nonprofit that partners with schools and families to embrace a broad definition of success and implement research-based strategies that promote student well-being and engagement with learning. Dr. Pope is the author of Doing School: How We Are Creating a Generation of Stressed Out, Materialistic, and Miseducated Students, which was awarded Notable Book in Education by the American School Board Journal, and lead author of Overloaded and Underprepared: Strategies for Stronger Schools and Healthy, Successful Kids. She also co-hosts the Stanford University Sirius XM radio show called Schools In. She lectures nationally on parenting techniques and pedagogical strategies to increase student health, engagement with learning, and integrity. Dr. Pope is a 3-time recipient of the Stanford University School of Education Outstanding Teacher and Mentor Award, and was honored with the 2012 Education Professor of the Year Educator's Voice Award from the Academy of Education, Arts, and Sciences. Prior to teaching at Stanford, Dr. Pope taught high school English in Fremont, California, and college composition and rhetoric courses at Santa Clara University. Her presentation this afternoon is entitled Balancing Academic Rigor and Care, Preparing Students for the Future by Creating Space for Wellbeing and Belonging, which will offer insight into the realities students experience daily and why making policy and practice changes at school will better prepare them for the future. Dr. Pope, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Kristin, and thank you, Cristiano. I have always known that Challenge Success, the organization that I co-founded, was really aligned with Jesuit education. We've worked with many Jesuit schools across the country, but this history is fabulous. I kept taking notes and taking pictures to tell my staff, because really it is that last slide in particular, just this notion of why we're here and how we do it and how we attach get to rigor is going to just dovetail perfectly with what I'm about to say. So yay. So let me share my screen. This is always the scariest part for me. Let's see if this works. And I want to do it from it doesn't ever let me do it from slideshow from the beginning. Okay, so a little interactivity just to break things up. If you have access to the chat, I would love for you to put a number between 1 and 5 in the chat that answers this question. I'm going to give you some definitions in a second. On a scale of 1 to 5, to what extent are your students' lives unduly stressed this year? You have to understand what unduly means here. 1 is an appropriate level of stress. Not all stress is bad. It's a little bit of butterflies in your stomach, maybe before you do something hard, you get on stage, you do a talk, whatever. That's an appropriate level of stress. That's called eustress, E-U-S-T-R-E-S-S. And at the other end is distress, a word that we're very familiar with, detrimental levels of stress, where you start to sweat, you start to not think that you have the resources to get through it, you start to agonize over it, maybe it causes anxiety, and you don't really come back to a sense of stasis. So you don't feel like you can get through it, and even when it's over, there's still that feeling of stress. So let's just take a quick peek at the chat. I see some folks have already been putting some numbers in. And I know that we work K through 12 here. So, you know, some of these might be lower. Some of you at the high school level might be higher. But thank you for putting these numbers in. We're seeing a pretty wide range, although we are seeing quite a few 3s and 4s. I haven't been seeing any 5s, so keep those coming. Thank you for that. And I want you to think about the causes, the reasons behind this stress. And I would say at this point in the research, we're basically saying pick a cause, right? It could be the pandemic. It could be overload. It could be social media and the pressures to be on all the time. It could be TikTok. It could be global warming. It could be home life issues and housing insecurity, food insecurity. Pick a cause, right, is what we're at right now. And I think it's probably a combination of a lot of these things. Where we come into play at Challenge Success as we work with the schools and the families to help make some changes. And I want to give you a little bit, just like Cristiano gave a little history, I want to give you a little bit of history as well, which is, let's see if this will let me go back to this. I think when I go around and talk to schools and parents that we have really competing definitions of success in this world. And when we talk to students in particular, they say that it has to do with money, it has to do with grades and test scores. I'll give you this quote from Kevin, who I shadowed 5 kids who helped me write the first book for an entire school year at a school that was a public school, but could have easily been a Jesuit school. And I saw him raise his hand and kind of look like he was interested. And I said, oh, what were you interested in learning that day? And he said, look, people don't go to school to learn. They go to get good grades, which brings them to college, which brings them the high-paying job, or which brings them to happiness, or so they think. And over again, I kept hearing this really limited, narrow definition of success. If those of you who are visual, you can kind of see how kids think that happiness is connected to success and money, and you got to get the grades in middle school in order to get into a really great Jesuit high school. You got to get the grades in high school to get into a prestigious university in order to get the high-paying job and the money. And if for some reason you don't get into university, all of this goes away. And there's this belief among many of our students and some of our parents, and certainly the messages that get out through the media, that this is a very linear, narrow view of how we define success, very different from what Cristiano was describing in the letters. And what we know is that the path to success is much like this. It's circuitous. It's not a straight line. It often has nothing to do with grades and test scores. And there's gonna be bumps and ups and downs along the way. And it's our job to really help cultivate that in our students, to let them reach their own definitions of success, their family's definition of success. I would say the Jesuit definition of success. On this path, there's going to be bumps, but it's not like you either do this and there's one misstep and that's it. So why this disconnect? Part of it is how we set up the learning experiences. Again, turning to the history of Cristiano, I think we can have aspirations to model what these early letters said, but that's not always happening. So I want to give you a sense from the data from our survey. We have now had over 310,000 middle and high school students complete surveys in over 300 schools across the US. Some are Jesuit, some are public, some are independent, other parochial Jewish schools, etc. Lots and lots of questions. I'm just going to give you a snapshot of what the life of these sort of high achieving schools tend to have for their students. They tend to have a lot of homework. In fact, over 30% of our sample is doing more than 3.5 hours a night of homework. So go back to that letter from Cristiano. Are they balancing? It's very hard to balance when you're doing this much homework. And the kicker is over 50% perceive that most of their homework is busy work. It doesn't mean that that's what we're giving them. It doesn't mean we're giving them busy work, but that's how they're perceiving it. And that's really hard to do and keep going for 3.5 hours if you don't see the meaning behind it. They are very busy, which is a wonderful thing. Extracurriculars are very good. They get your body in motion, you meet new people, you learn new skills, but how much is too much? Particularly look at that high school number. This is just Monday through Friday. We didn't count weekends. You've got some kids doing nothing in that range, up to 35 hours a week. They're getting up before school to do swim team and football practice, and Model United Nations happens after school and whatnot, and we can go on and on and on. Not to mention chores and taking care of siblings and helping parents with paid work as well, right? So they're very, very busy, which means what is not happening is they're not getting the sleep that I was so thrilled to hear way back when in the letters the Jesuits knew, because this is absolutely in line with current research. What is recommended for middle school students is between 9 and 11 hours of sleep every night, up to 13 years old. If you're over 13 years old, you need between 8 and 10. And you can see from our research, they're not even coming close to this. They're busy, they're overscheduled, they're exhausted. And when I work with students and parents, I really get across the consequences of sleep deprivation, which back in the 1500s, it seems like folks knew way back then. The connection between mental health and sleep is huge. We are seeing higher incidence of depression and anxiety, definitely linked to sleep deprivation. Causation does not equal correlation. I don't know which comes first, but what we do know is that there's a bivariate correlation now. If you are very, very sleep deprived, it can trigger a depressive episode, as well as if you're very depressed or anxious, you're going to have trouble sleeping, and so it compounds. There's memory issues, we see bullying, we see more car accidents due to drowsy driving of teens than drunk driving. If there's one message to parents that you want to get out to your student body and your parents, it is please get more sleep. And I know how hard that is in a world where there's constant beeps and bleeps, things keeping your brain up at night. So the academic tools that we tend to see is widespread disengagement. They call themselves robo students for a reason, that you could be getting very good grades, but not really being engaged in the sense that we're talking about academic excellence. And we're seeing a very, very high, even from our religious schools, a high amount of cheating going on, sometimes as high as 80%. We're also seeing a real lack of creativity. I was really drawn to that word, that creativity is part of what we're after as we think about excellence, and a real inability to solve complex problems. We learn in little boxes called history and English and chemistry, but problems don't present themselves in that way. So part of this thinking about academic excellence is, what do we really mean? What do we want these kids to get out? When they're out, what skills are they able to do? Really think out of the box, solve complex problems, and be prepared with these very important 21st century skills that Cristiano also mentioned: critical thinking, creativity, self-regulation, social emotional learning. These are probably more important than the content and the skills themselves, because they are the habits that really make you into the person, the holistic person that we're after in the Jesuit education and in all education. We are seeing, as I mentioned, some real health tolls, a very scary lack of resilience, that sort of one thing goes and that's it. Your third grader ends up in a puddle on the floor because they forgot their homework for the first time. We're seeing more and more kids turn towards substance use as a coping strategy, not just like experimentation with marijuana, but I am so stressed and so busy and so overloaded that I am turning to drinking alcohol or getting high or whatever it is as a way to get through the week, right? I had such a stressful week, I need to do this. Other debilitating disorders, perfectionism, eating disorders, suicide ideation, etc. I don't mean to depress you. We're going to get into some solutions here, but I want you to know that kids who even appear like they're doing well, we are not meeting their full needs, both in terms of health and academics. So this is where we come in. We partner with school communities to really elevate the student voice. They're the ones going through it. We want to hear from them and implement research-based, equity-centered strategies to improve student well-being, belonging, and engagement. And how do we do that? This is our theory. And again, I love this connection because it's very much in line with what Cristiano was telling us about the Jesuit tradition. This is actually our definition of success. And I think it fits that quote that Cristiano put out. You must have well-being. If you are so tired and exhausted that you can't get out of bed in the morning, you're never going to have success and you're not going to be able to learn. You must feel like you belong, like your superior is acting with loving kindness and treats you with care, right? Cristiano's words. And you have to feel like what you're learning is valuable, meaningful, and do it in such a way that is joyful, that you keep the light on in your eyes. So these three things all correlate in the research. What we say to schools is we kind of don't care which one of these you really want to focus on first, because they all correlate, but the goal is to get to well-being, belonging, and engaged learning at a very high amount for all of our kids. The definition of belonging is pretty clear. There's various ones, but it's this individual feeling. You can't just say to someone, you belong. I'm telling you, you belong. They have to feel like they belong. They have to feel like they are accepted and respected as a valued contributor in a specific environment. You might feel like you belong in English class, but you really don't belong in your math class. You might feel like you belong on the football field, but you really don't belong at home, right? So we're after having kids feel like they belong. You could see from the research that it's much lower than we'd like it to be in many, many, many of our schools. Other students here like me the way that I am. I feel like a part of the school. I feel accepted. I feel like I can really be myself. We want that to be higher. What messages are we sending in our school that it's more important to get, fill in the blank, a grade or score the goal than it is to feel like you're accepted and valued? Let's watch what we're rewarding. Let's watch what we're messaging around when it comes to belonging, and really ask the students how they feel. Do you feel like you can bring your whole self to this classroom or to this community? A very common question in suicide studies is if a student has an adult to go to if they have a personal problem. We have very caring teachers, very much support, but at 70%, we'd like to see that higher. 56% feel that most or all of their teachers value and listen to their students' ideas. So what messages are you sending every day that's causing them to answer this question in this way? When it comes to engagement, it's the same thing. I want us all to be on the same page about how we define engagement here. Engagement I talk about the ABCs. Affective engagement is you find schoolwork interesting and you enjoy doing it. There's a pleasure to learning, right? It is not a drudgery. Behavioral, I think most of our kids are pretty good about completing the assignments and working hard. And cognitively, they need to feel that the work they're doing is valuable and meaningful, building skills and understanding that they see themselves using. We are after full engagement. That's where the research is very clear that you have higher well-being and higher belonging, the more fully engaged you are. And yet in our schools, full engagement is actually pretty rare. Most of the time in our schools, we're seeing this. We're seeing doing school, where the kids are very much behaviorally engaged. They're doing the work, but they're not finding the joy or the interest in it, and they don't see the meaning or the value. So our role is to get back to that sort of original definition of academic excellence in a Jesuit tradition, is for them to really see the meaning and value in it, to want to do the work, and to find joy and pleasure in the doing it. Not an easy task. This is how we help schools get there, and this is what I want to really focus on for the rest of the talk. We have acronyms all the time at Stanford. You probably have it at your schools and universities. And this particular acronym comes from us looking at lots and lots of research around best practices around learning and schooling. And it's every kid needs his or her space in school. And it comes from the title of the talk. The S is really looking at students' schedule and use of time. I think too much of what we do in schools is pushed by a very hectic schedule where students don't have time to sit and reflect. Again, very fascinating. There should be a 30-minute break for every 2 hours of study. We don't do that. We don't even come close to doing that in schools. Yet we know from brain studies, from putting people in MRIs and looking at tasks now in science, that kind of still holds. It's about every 90 minutes. We are told that an adult or a child needs to take a break, get up, walk around, do something. So if you are still having a schedule of 45-minute periods 8 times a day, I want you to think differently. I want you to think about what time that school starts, because we know that later start times are better for kids and they get more sleep. Look at the transitions. We ask teachers to shadow students throughout the day, start at the bus stop and end long after the sports practice or the music rehearsal, to see what that feels like to go through such a busy day. And really look at your load, look at your homework load, look at how many assessments you're asking kids to take in a week. The schedule affects everyone at the school, from the adults, the students, the coaches, the parents, etc. The P is really pedagogy. And again, I was fascinated to see this sort of emphasis on a variety of pedagogy that Cristiano alluded to, about debates and whatnot, that it's not just sit and get, it's not just lecture, right? And I think that's something that we love about the Jesuit tradition, is you really do try to do more varied ways of pedagogy. You try to make projects relevant. We would love to see even more student voice and choice in what they're learning and how they're learning it, even if it's just little baby choices, like you could do these problems or these problems for homework, or pick a problem from each section, to larger choices where they get to actually choose what they're going to do a deep dive in terms of a project or an essay or whatnot. And I think a big distinction here that I want you to understand, particularly given what Kristin was saying about rigor, is that rigor does not equal load. I think in a lot of people's brains, the more work, the more homework, the better the class, the better the teacher. I think parents get caught up in this. I think kids get caught up in this. I think some of us as educators can get caught up in this. I know that you can have a very rigorous, challenging, appropriate challenge of curriculum with really reducing the load. As a former English teacher, how many books did I try to teach that first couple of years of teaching versus what I do now, where you really limit and you go deeper. So I want you to do some really hard soul searching about rigor versus load in your own curriculum, at your school, and in your own classroom. This goes along with assessment. We want alternative and authentic assessment. We want to encourage revision and redemption. In the real world, this happens all the time. In the real world, there's not tests where you can't use the resources around you. There's maybe a driving test, but you get to take that over and over again. We want kids to learn from their mistakes. We want to look at our grading policies and say, is this really in the best interest of the child? Why am I giving all these zeros? They can't crawl their way out of zero. An F grade is actually better than a 0. It's 50 points versus 0. So really taking a deeper dive into these assessment practices. Aligned with the Jesuit tradition is a real focus on a climate of care. And most of the Jesuit schools that I go to, you can really feel that care. It's palpable, right? How can we work even more so to promote positive coping strategies for kids? About a third of our sample feels that they don't have any positive coping strategies, and that's why they're turning to these negative coping strategies. And to incorporate more time for teachers and students to get to know each other, create connections, have small group advisories or almost little mini families that stay together through the years. The E in space is really educating the whole community, parents, students, and faculty members about the developmental needs of kids. And my last few minutes here, I just want to run you through some of the examples. So everything in space, we have workshops on, and we can go deeper in. This is just a quick overview. When I present to families, I ask, and to students, we ask them how they're spending their time and which parts of this sort of pie, this 24-hour school day, is way too big and way too small. And we give them a mnemonic aid called playtime, downtime, and family time, which I think fits right in with the Jesuit tradition of protective factors. And as parents, how can they protect time for free unstructured play, appropriate sleep and downtime, appropriate family time? And I would say the same thing to schools. How can you make sure that you have playtime, downtime, and family time in your school as well, right? I love that the Jesuits invented recess. We work really hard with schools to even look at how much recess time are your kids actually getting? How much downtime are they having at school? And the elephant in the room, and I sort of anticipate this coming up because it comes up a lot, is college and university, which of course is a goal for many, many, many of our schools. But there's this real misconception that much of particularly high school stress is driven by the belief that there are a few highly selective colleges that are possibly hard to get into, and success and happiness depend on getting into one of them. And what we do is we've written a paper. This is on our website. It's free. You can download it. I'm going to give you another link to some free things that basically shows it's not the college, it's the kid, and it's how they go, not where they go. Research shows that a student's engagement in their college program matters much more in the long run than college ranking or name. And I think if we can help convince people of this, we spent a year looking at the research and writing this up, making it really, really convincing that we don't just do these things to get the grades, to get the scores, to get into college. We are after really the whole child. And for success for us, it's where they find the right fit for post-secondary education, whatever that may be, and how they are prepared with the skills that we've given them, that we've imbued with them through our Jesuit education to really thrive and succeed, not just in post-secondary education, but also in life. So upcoming events, just a little plug here. If you want to know more, our website is challengesuccess.org. We have free events coming up, and just in this month alone, we put on a lot of events. Lynn Lyons is on anxiety. Kelly Corrigan and I are going to talk about what's the point of college. And then very similar to what you saw with the time wheel and sort of the elephant in the room kind of slides is the well-balanced student on May 10th. So I just want to keep within my time. I know we have lots of great speakers, but I am thrilled to see just how aligned, I knew it was to start, but even more so just how aligned Cristiano's presentation and mine are when it comes to overall Jesuit goals. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Denise. You know, it's terrific to hear your insights and to know that a number of our schools have had such positive, longstanding relationships with Challenge Success. So it's just exciting to get to hear a bit of a primer on your work and the terrific resource that it is for really all of our schools to think about, to challenge each of us on our own competing definition of success, and to hear about, you know, research that points to a kind of scary level of lack of resilience in kids. It's startling. And to hear the words busy, overscheduled, exhausted, and for all of us listening here, thinking about what are our goals, and again to remember to hold at the front of our minds the ideal of engaged learning, belonging, and well-being as kind of the big three goals. You know, we've talked a lot about why this conversation on academic rigor is important right now at this moment in time, and to think about how it does connect so fully with so much of what was exposed of the conversation just in the world around the pandemic about a work-life balance, kind of outside of schooling and education, but just in our own life. So thank you for so many of those connections there to our work. We're grateful for your contributions here. I'm very pleased to turn now to our first Ignatian educator reflection. We will get him up on the screen here to introduce Reverend Mario Powell, S.J., who is the 6th president of Brooklyn Jesuit Prep. Father Powell is an accomplished educator who has taught and worked in both secondary and middle school settings within the Jesuit system of the Jesuits USA East Province. Father Powell has served at Regis High School in Manhattan as director of the REACH program. REACH is an educational and leadership program that prepares middle school students from families with financial need to earn scholarships to Regis, as well as to other leading high schools in New York City. Since moving to Brooklyn, Father Powell has relocated Brooklyn Jesuit Prep to a newly renovated facility in East Flatbush. He tirelessly raises funds to ensure Jesuit education thrives in low-income neighborhoods in Brooklyn. His success in fundraising and leading his school attests to his focus on the importance of quality education in changing the trajectory of the lives of students from migrant and minority families. With both undergraduate and graduate degrees from Boston College and St. Louis University, Father Powell is well-versed in Jesuit education and its power to change trajectories and lift students out of poverty. In addition to serving on Lemoyne's College Board of Trustees, Father Powell is a trustee at Fairfield University, Lemoyne College, Regis High School, and he is vice chair of the board at Xavier High School in New York. This will be Father Powell's final year at Brooklyn Jesuit Prep. The provincial has recently named him the assistant for pre-secondary and secondary education for the Jesuits East Province. This afternoon, Father Powell offers his reflection on our symposium content so far as an experienced educator from the vantage of our nativity school communities who have long been committed to the balance of rigor and care, serving the holistic needs of their students. Father Powell.
Thank you, Kristin. It's very difficult to come after those first two speakers, Dr. Casalini and Dr. Pope. But as I was listening to them, the first thing that popped into my mind was nativity schools already do much of what has been talked about in these first two presentations. In a way, I was just thinking the past is prologue in a way that nativity schools, because of the model that we are, we do kind of that extra stuff. We are, maybe some would be appalled, but we start school in an ungodly hour. Our kids arrive at 7 o'clock. Our kids are still currently in school for another 15 minutes. We do that in part so parents can go to work and have the peace of mind that their sons and daughters are not at home alone. We bring in dentists, we bring in doctors, we bring in personal trainers. There's always been that context within the nativity school model to, if you're going to be able to teach a student math and science, well, you're going to have to take care of other needs that the student, not only just the student, but also that their families may have as well. And so I just throw that out there that I'm very proud of the nativity school approach to Jesuit education. And I think, as I've been saying for a number of years, I think a number of our traditional high schools have a lot to learn from how we care for our students. The other thing I would say on this first point is, especially as a trustee, I have for years talked about the well-being and belonging, especially of our students of color and our students who are low income. And in so many ways, the pandemic actually has forced educators in our Jesuit schools to actually listen, because prior to the pandemic, this was certainly a minority of students where that I was referencing in terms of how many of our students of color actually feel after 4 years that they belong, that they actually want to come back to an alumni event. And now I hear this more and more being spoken within the context of education, and that makes me very, very happy, because I think those words of belonging are very important for all of our students. The second thing that came to mind was within the mission statement of Brooklyn Jesuit Prep, we mentioned that education is transformative. And I think that is an important aspect for us to remember, that our students are in the halls of Brooklyn Jesuit Prep in part so we can transform their trajectory, where they're headed, absolutely certainly in terms of high school. But we think that trajectory is not only high school, but college and beyond, and that impacts younger brothers, younger sisters, and families as well. And so the changing of the trajectory is I think it is an extremely important part of this conversation. Now, to be honest, that's also what our donors want to hear. Our donors want to hear that we are making an impact on this demographic. But the other constituency that wants to hear this, quite frankly, are parents. Parents want to, especially with the fact that we are largely, our student body is largely made up of sons and daughters of immigrants. And I was smiling at some parts of the previous presentation because I absolutely agree with it, but I could never say some of that stuff to our parents, especially immigrant parents, largely from the Caribbean, where they look at student success as being going to certain schools, getting certain grades, going into certain professions, and certainly attempting to change how our parents think of these things is absolutely a must. But so many of our parents don't come to us because we want to care for their sons and daughters. They come for us because of the rigor of the education that they know that they're going to get. And so keeping that in mind in terms of just the demographics that we serve, it's a challenge to use some of the language that we use to our parents as a constituency. The other point is admissions, and this was brought up in the last presentation. There have been, I can't tell you how many times I've sat in a board meeting and just heard and watched our schools look at how successful they are by looking at the U.S. News and World Report, and large chunks of time, in my opinion, wasted on how many of our kids got into highly selective, really selective, etc. I realize that is an important aspect of what we do, but how sad it is for us as Jesuit institutions to measure the success of what it means to be successful at any given Jesuit secondary school by how many of our kids got into Harvard or Yale or Stanford. It's great that they go to those schools, but I would love for us to measure ourselves by, have we changed the trajectory of our students, not by the name brand of the institutions that our students end up in. My next reflection is I love the slide from the first presentation on with the focus on teachers and teaching rigor. I think often in this conversation on academic excellence and rigor, we leave out the teachers as part of what we mean by academic excellence and rigor as well. I'll be honest, I run a school in which I underpay every single person in the building. I overwork every single person in the building. And I think the model that we follow as try to do more with less time. Well, welcome to the nativity model. Welcome to the Cristo Rey model of education, where we try to do more and more. And but one thing that came to mind post-pandemic or during the pandemic was one of my most veteran teachers, and she's going to kill me when she watches this video. She's definitely an old school teacher. She's our longest serving faculty member. I think her style of education is she deconstructs our students and builds them back up over the course of the year. And our students who come back and tell us that the schools had an impact on them, they always go to her and point to her as she's had the greatest impact. Why? And they always point to the rigor of her classroom. And I think a lot of our parents would point to that old school type of rigor of it being harder and as being something that's a sign of success within the classroom. The contrast to that is I can go to that particular teacher's classroom and I almost feel she calls on me when I go into the classroom, and I feel like I have to be on my toes in that classroom, but she definitely is in control of what is going on in that classroom. And I think our students are slightly afraid of her. The contrast of that is that young teacher that I have that's straight out of college, who is talking to our students about their feelings, who is talking to our students about, what do they do on the weekends? What kind of music, getting to know the student. Are they the best teacher in terms of pedagogy? Absolutely not. But are they filling in the gaps where these students may not necessarily get that from this maybe more old school teacher? Absolutely. And I was very pleased to see that slide from the first presentation about the rigorous teacher being the teacher who cares, who gets to know their student. And I think for those of us that work in the non-traditional spaces in the nativity world and Cristo Rey model worlds, we know what that means of because we have to do this in order for us to function. It's not an optional thing for us to be able to do. Two last reflections were one on happiness. If I were to ask our parents, is the point of your son or daughter coming to our school, is it for them to be happy? I can almost guarantee you none of them are going to say yes. However, I think if you were to ask the teachers, is happiness a part of what we are attempting to form our students in? I think you'd get most of our teachers saying absolutely yes. And I think our teachers are in part attempting to teach the love of and for learning, which I think is extremely important as our students are stressed out about all sorts of things. They're stressed out about what kind of high school they're going to get into. They're stressed out about how much money they're going to get from high schools. They're stressed out about, who are they going to take to a middle school dance? All these stressors, but sometimes it's just taking a step back and asking our students what makes them happy within the context of Jesuit education. And I would say my last point is the resetting of habits. I think it's extremely important in light of the pandemic that one of the things that we've had to focus on in Brooklyn is resetting our students' habits. Our students got into a lot of bad habits during the pandemic. And they were habits that allowed them to cope and survive, and sometimes small apartments with siblings that they were babysitting. But those are habits that we have been attempting to really try to reset. And those are, those habits are around the use of social media, the unhealthful use of social media, in some cases, the lack of socialization during the pandemic has led to just a real lack of being able to fit back in and social norms. And so just the need to really be that modern day rigorous teacher who is attempting to help our students not only change their trajectory, but really attempting to get them to reset their habits in a way that will allow them to be successful young men, successful young women. And by success, what we're trying to teach our students is we try to help them define what that actually means for them. And that is, their success is not measured whether or not they get into the elite all-girls school or the elite Jesuit school in Manhattan. We want our students to realize that that Jesuit education shouldn't be elitist. It allows them access to something that they wouldn't have at another school. But we're not trying to indoctrinate them into a world that, as many of our students would say, a white world or a world that is so foreign from their context. And so those are some of my reflections from those first two presentations. But I'm very happy to say, with history on my side, that from the nativity school model, that we do a lot of what the early Jesuits did. And that makes me very proud as a middle school educator.
Thank you so much, Mario. Thank you especially for your willingness to kind of share and react in the moment here on a live program. We're really grateful for that. The idea of being proud of the nativity approach to education, it can't be understated. And as you said, how much our traditional schools or legacy schools can learn from the education that's happening in your halls. It's really inspiring. Again, some of the ideas that we're hearing about the pandemic forcing us to listen to this. I loved what you said about the resetting of habits for kids and what that looks like at Brooklyn Jesuit. And then the language that you use of changing of trajectory as extremely important in this conversation. That is so crucial, and again gets to Denise's conversation of how we define success and what that looks like, and urging all of us to move beyond the prestige and so on and the name brand, as you said, and instead focusing on the changing of trajectories. I find that terrifically motivating, and the reminder of how this conversation fits within the demographics of our schools. So thank you so much for your insights here. We're grateful. It's my pleasure to introduce our next session here. Dr. Patricia Peak is the Dean of Undergraduate Admission and Associate Vice President for Fordham University, and has been with the university in a professional capacity since 1998. She has experienced Fordham from a variety of vantage points. As an undergraduate and graduate student, a student worker, graduate assistant, adjunct faculty, alumna, and as an administrator. She holds a doctorate in English literature and is a triple Fordham Ram. Patricia is actively involved in the admissions profession. She's been a member of and co-chaired various committees for the Common Application, the College Board, and the New York State Association for College Admissions Counseling. She is a member of the National Association for College Admissions Counseling, known as NACAC. In 2012, she was on the faculty of the AJCU Seminar in Higher Education Leadership. In 2010, she was named a recipient of the New York State Association for College Admissions Counseling Distinguished Service Award College. Dr. Peak will share today her insights on the current landscape in admissions and how rigor is used in her setting, and how schools can best communicate to universities their sense of excellence in the context of Jesuit education. In her session entitled Competitive University Admissions and Post-Pandemic College Preparatory Education, Shifting Perspectives in an Undergraduate Admissions Office. And Dr. Peak is very familiar with our students across the JSN, having worked with them for many years in the admissions process. So Dr. Peak, thank you for being here.
Thank you, Kristin. This is a real privilege for me to be here, and I will try to do justice to all of my colleagues at other colleges and universities that have so many perspectives on this. And it's a privilege to be in the middle of this program, and I was vigorously taking notes and making additions to my PowerPoint based on both Cristiano, Denise, and Father Powell's comments, which I think fit very well with the state of college admission currently. So I'm going to also, Denise, the scary moment of sharing my screen that I hope actually will share, and then move to slideshow. Here we go. So the historical context, Cristiano, you hit upon so many of the things that we at Jesuit colleges and universities talk about all of the time, but have to translate to our students, the students that you bring to us. In the Jesuit tradition, our students know from their experience with you at both the K and the K through 12 world exactly what some of these terms mean, but we also have to then educate students who have no idea what Jesuit education is, and try to have them understand what we're about. And so we often, especially at Fordham, talk about the 500 years of rigor embedded in Ignatian and Jesuit philosophy. And I think it was great, Cristiano, that you kind of tempered that a little bit, right? About how that really needs to fit in the modern world and what that was defined at in the past. And that it is a standard of excellence, but it's much more than that. And we do try to unpack the magis in different ways. And I love the idea of recreations, right? So we talk about magis, especially at Fordham, about this idea of pushing yourself, about finding the greater good, but that it is linked to that cura personalis, that dignity of the whole person, and really that this rigor happens inside and outside of the classroom. So we're trying to take those traditions, those Jesuit traditions, and really look at students in the admission process in that same historical context, that it is inclusivity, it is trying to bring students in, it is trying to see if we can find ways to find students who are ready to be open. And part of academic rigor, I think, is that openness to understanding those critical thinking skills, that interdisciplinary nature of knowledge. So thank you for that foundation. I think that really helps when you look at a Jesuit college's philosophy or their information session, what they're talking about. We really are trying to base it in that. But that last point about forming leaders, men and women for others, that hominis pro aliis is so critical to that rigor of the person, not just academic rigor, but how can I be active in the world, a steward in the world? And so I'll try to unpack some of that as well. And it is a changing landscape. These last few years have been a frightening landscape, I think, for everybody in every way, and particularly for students. But I do think that there are some positives that have come out of it, but some things that we have to navigate together. So first of all, the common application. This was even pre-pandemic. The common application has allowed our students the ability to apply to so many different places. And that freedom of choice is a marvelous thing, but it is a stress inducer. And as Denise had said, this ability to keep having all of these options, this buffet in front of us, can lead to so many stressors that I believe that my colleagues on this call, as well as on the other side of the desk, on the admission side, are always trying to say, we need to de-stress this. You need to not have the application process take over your senior year. You need to not have it take over your life. You need to still think about the schools that are matches for you. And Jenny Ricard, who is the president and CEO of the Common App, she uses a word that was also said today, and that is joyful. And she constantly reminds her membership that we should be trying to bring joy. And we're in the Easter season, right? So bring joy to this process, that this should be something that students are looking to have as a positive for them. So trying to de-escalate is something that I think we all want to do, but we have pressures that are beyond us. And Father Powell mentioned them. We are at the mercy of the rankings and who follows them and what the different rankings weigh and say we should value. The different pressure from all the boards to increase selectivity, to increase position on all of those sides, right? So we're in kind of the crosshairs of all of these pressures, some of which we can control and others which are beyond our control. And I do think helping our students navigate, and we say this often in the college application process, focus on what you can control. You're going to have to just put aside the things that you can't control, what a college might be looking for in that particular year that you would have no way of knowing, what factors could change things that you have no way to control. There's enough that a student can control and we can help them control, that should be what we're focusing on. So helping that balance. And I don't know, from a sociological or psychological standpoint, how to frame that. Denise probably would be better with that, but it's that balance, right, of not letting ourselves get caught up into these things. And there's also the pressures of, I think, finances, and that has come into particular focus this year. Inflationary costs, just the high cost of living in general and higher education, the value of higher education. Some families are wrestling with that too. And as Father Powell noted, the stressors, where you are culturally, that's meaningful for some families more than others. And what does that create for students? COVID-19 and remote learning. I would say that there isn't an institution out there that isn't cognizant that added a different level of pressure to students and that impacted how their academic rigor would manifest itself on transcripts and in college applications. And I think it has been important to say from day one of the pandemic to now that impact has to still remain in the conversation. It's not just about the students who were seniors in 2020 or the juniors last year. It is the K through 12 students all along the years who had that impact that has now really kind of changed their trajectory in ways that were beyond their control, that we are going to have to keep being mindful of as we go through. Hopefully it will lessen its impact, but it's important for us to contextualize and keep that at the forefront. A positive piece, I think, is the test optional movement. The fact that so many of us kind of let go of that and said, what do we need to do instead of focusing on tests, which is not really the entire story. But to the point of this talk, it puts a little bit more focus on that rigor piece, right? So let's talk a little bit about that. So why is academic rigor important? For us and many institutions, it is the holistic review is the foundation, and what a student is doing in the classroom is what we would call, what I call the long view or the film. I always say to students, what you do in high school is like we're watching a movie. If you just take a test, that's like a snapshot. I want to watch the movie. I want to see your story unfold. Your SAT is just a glimpse. It's not always even the right angle, right? So the 4-year transcript is important to us. What are we looking for? Evidence not always an actual translation into an A, right? But evidence of a demonstrated ability to succeed at the college level. And we all know why that's important, because college is an investment. And if a student goes to a college where they're not going to succeed academically, that can put some students back years that may never recover from it. Other students will have more depth and resilience and can transfer and move on. But we have to be mindful that all of us are just making sure that students are having that base rigor performance so that they can be successful. A willing to challenge oneself, and I want to go back to both in and out of the classroom, as Cristiano said, right? When we're talking about rigor, we're also seeing how that happens outside of the prescribed curriculum. It can be in how students engage in the world around them, not even limited to their high school, how they're engaging in the world around them. And it should be unique. We know that this is contextual. It's unique to both the student and the school that they're coming from. So there is no single definition for academic rigor, nor how any school will look at it. And it has changed. Has it changed? I would say it's changed. It's evolved, it's expanded, and it has become more important in the absence of testing. So most of us have shifted some of our weight, not only to the high school transcript, but even more to what's going on in that transcript. But the role of critical thinking, how students are resilient, we heard that word today, so important. A student can have a C on their transcript, but the way they bounce back from that can make all the difference, right? So, depending on how super selective the school is, we shouldn't let challenges in the curriculum mean that the student can't be successful. It's all about what we do to build from that. And I was so heartened to hear everybody talk about the role of others, other than the college counselor at the secondary school, how important everyone's role is in this. And let me show you how that appears in our work. But before I do that, 4 of my colleagues at other Jesuit schools, I didn't want this to only be Fordham. I asked them just solely, how do you look at academic rigor? So the quotes that you have here are only about academic rigor, not about everything. We're talking about a holistic read. But the things I want to pull out for you is context is important. Context of the high school. So from Santa Clara, those 2 terms, extremely important. From Loyola, New Orleans, never wanting to penalize a student for something outside of their control. So how that comes into this. From Holy Cross, the preparation for college level work and the openness to embracing challenge. So it's also about openness. And from Boston College, pushing themselves to their potential and being best positioned for college success. So let's look at the role of the secondary school writ large. It's relationship building between colleges and high schools, the conversations, the visits, the panels, what we're doing here today, the way we get to know each other is a treasure, I think, in college admission amongst the Jesuit network, because we get to have deep and meaningful conversations. So the role of the school in fostering that with our many new colleagues, and we know that one of the other pressures we just have in college admission is that we lost many people during the pandemic and the Great Resignation. So how do we rebuild the relationships that so many of us had in new ways? I would stress that the school profile and transcript, I think we know they're essential tools, but to talk just a little bit about how we use them, they're very important when a relationship is new or not developed. I often laugh that, and my colleagues from Regis and Xavier and Loyola on the call, I was their counselor for 24 years. I think I could walk into a classroom and know what to expect because I've known the school for so long. But I just handed those schools off to someone who's not worked with them before. And I know that the profiles are helping that person understand the schools and get kind of that initial foot in the door. Oh, okay, let me get the mindset here of how I should be thinking about academic rigor within the context of this school, as opposed to in the context of another school. So important. I think as Father Powell said, so important to boards, right? They're looking at that page where what schools did you get into, you know, and how many did you enroll? That's wonderful. But the part that we need is the part where you're talking about the school itself, the clarity of your description, your overview of your curricular levels, a key to your transcript, and the opportunities for academic and non-academic challenge outside of the curriculum. So what do I mean by that? Maybe you have a relationship with a college where you can take extra courses at the college level, or maybe you're offering a travel program or a study abroad or a immersion program. All of you talk about that in many meaningful ways, but we're pulling rigor from that, a different kind of rigor, right? This student investment. So I took a few high school profiles from Jesuit schools, and I took some keywords out that I think show the beauty of how you already conveyed this information to us. And I wanted to see how these words resonated with you. These were things that jumped out at me that maybe you wouldn't think initially say rigor, but can say rigor in this broader context of the world we're living in. Committed, to have conscience, to be part of a community, people for others, training the intellect, advancing the common good, scholarship, of course, but inclusive. Integrity of lifelong learning, we heard that today. To justly serve, foster, seeking, what great active words that we're finding. Intensive, and of course, Ignatian tradition. So to get back to Cristiano, how many of these words would Ignatius and his companions say, yes, that's what I was thinking about. That's what we mean. So I think all of this is really there. And I just want to applaud everyone that you're doing this work. It's there. So of course, I think what's obvious for everyone is counselor contributions. You provide context, you highlight areas of challenge and success in and out of the classroom. You note areas that might not be self-evident for the admission office about a student. You make it clear when certain levels of rigor were not achievable and why. How important, right? If a student sometimes has one misstep, that upper level course will never be open to them. But when you tell us that that was the only reason why, how different, right? We're going to look at what was afforded to them and what they were able to do with that, or how they could circumvent that. So there's all of these amazing ways that the work that the counselors do translates to the admission officer. Teachers. When we look at letters from teachers, and we talked about their importance before, and I really want to underscore that, they focus on specific areas that they know about the student, the rigor, the challenge, the success. They add amazing context, things we would never know. And they add dimension that is not found in other places in the application. And so the work of that college application process is getting the right teachers to write those letters, you know, having a student go to the teacher that's really going to give us that depth, not quantity, the quality. And I think the one group that we have to talk about is how do students contribute to this, right? We put a lot of onus on ourselves, but students have to contribute to this. So when they come and they make their course selection, how did they maximize opportunities? How did they make the most of this curriculum? Even if the most rigorous wasn't available to them, what did they do differently? Back to this outside the classroom. Summer programs, enrichment, pipeline, college courses, not always available to everyone with their resources, but so many through CBOs and other organizations can help students at every socioeconomic level gain some access. Let's make sure that students tell us about that. Dual enrollment credit, travel, work, internships, experiential learning. I think that if you look at academic rigor within the context of the fact that a student is helping support their family and works 15 hours a week on top of the curriculum that they're taking, you get so much more depth about what that student can do. So they don't have to be in the most demanding curriculum. If they're balancing and succeeding, it's the context again. It's everything that we try to do to get to know a student. So we should continue to encourage that. And that's what we look at as a whole. I will invite questions later, but all I can say is thank you to everyone who I was with previously for setting me up for all of the things that we look at in college admission. And I look forward to the rest of our speakers. Thank you, Kristin.
Thank you so much, Patricia. You know, I had mentioned in the introduction that we had a terrific gathering, annual gathering of our principals in the fall, and your contributions to this conversation were really one of the points that principals were eager to hear. You know, the kind of pressures and the mystery, I think, that can oftentimes surround college admissions at the secondary and very likely pre-secondary level as well. So thank you for taking taking some of that mystery out. I appreciate hearing too the perspective of your colleagues at other universities. I think you really offer a direct challenge to us, to schools, to look at the things that we can control when it comes to the admissions process. And the biggest that I heard in the openness that you shared to learning from schools is, how do secondary schools explain their context to admissions? How do they explain what's important to them, what they value, what their balance is within their halls? Looking at the school profiles and the class profiles, which in many schools kind of have been around for a long time. So really digging into that at the secondary level and seeing, how do we represent what we value explicitly to universities? And I hear from you an openness to kind of knowing and valuing that clarity that they offer. And of course, the relationships with universities and transcripts and so on. So thank you for that. I also can't help but say that I think it was in 1999, my very first year at Regis High School, that I met you for the first time. So it's one of the blessings of Jesuit education that our paths still cross. So thank you for being here. I'm very pleased to welcome our next Ignatian educator reflector. Dr. Terra Caputo currently serves as the director of the Center for Ignatian Pedagogy at St. Ignatius High School in Cleveland, an institutional action research center that studies the cognitive, affective, and behavioral growth and wellness of adolescent boys. She also teaches 2 sections of English and coordinates the Student Research Fellows Program, an experiential learning opportunity that partners students and faculty research fellows studying, teaching, and learning at St. Ignatius High School. Previously in her time at St. Ignatius, she has served as the English Department Chair and as Professional Development Committee Chair, and founded the school's peer tutoring program. Before coming to St. Ignatius, Dr. Caputo served as the director of writing at Allegheny College, where she coordinated the college's 4-year writing program, facilitated faculty professional development, led the Writing Center, served on the academic leadership team, and taught classes on British literature, writing, and women's studies. She completed her doctorate in English at the University of Miami, where she served as a fellow in the composition department and co-taught graduate courses on writing instruction and mentored new graduate teaching assistants. Dr. Caputo is currently completing the educational leadership program at Creighton University and will graduate with a master's degree and a Catholic school leadership certificate this May. In addition to her work at St. Ignatius, she serves as adjunct faculty for the seminars in Ignatian leadership for the JSN and is a member of the Global Task Force on Contemporary Jesuit Education for the Society of Jesus. In her spare time, which I think there's very little, right? She engages in philosophical conversations with her 2-year-old daughter that begin and end with why, watches what her husband calls creepy detective shows, and has recently started relearning the piano after a 20-year hiatus. Dr. Caputo, we're so grateful for your being here. I know that there is a lot that's going on in your community there at St. Ignatius, and we're really thankful that you will share your insights this afternoon.
Thank you so much, Kristin. Some of you may have heard our community is currently mourning the loss of one of our students, and I'd like to ask for your help as a network in lifting us up in prayer. I'd also like to dedicate my reflections today to the gift that this young man's life was to our community and to his family. Listening, as I'll echo what my colleagues have said, listening to the other speakers has been so inspiring for me. So many points of connection here, and such a privilege to offer reflection. Our school has long been in partnership with Challenge Success, and speaking alongside Denise is such a privilege and treat. So many points of resonance there. So, I think so often when we take up this question of rigor, we build our conversations around assumptions about what it looks like, particularly in terms of the expectations that we set for our students and the work that we assign. And when Father Powell noted that the focus is so often on student performance, that really resonated with me. We tend to focus on defining what rigor is. And once we've defined it, often as difficult, challenging, as striving for excellence, we tend to see it as contradictory to students' well-being. When we talk about providing care to kids, I think we sometimes misperceive that providing care comes at the expense of rigor. And I think that bifurcation that happens of students' educational experiences, that rigor is in one sphere and care in the other, can be problematic, but I think it is emblematic of the way that we operate in these conversations. So, when Father Powell was referencing the two types of teachers, the one that cultivates rigor and the one getting to know her students, I think that can be emblematic of the conversation around rigor that we have. But I wonder if it can be limiting. I tend to agree with something Kristin mentioned in her introduction, and I would even argue that rigor can be an important and even invaluable part of a culture of care. The two, I don't think, are mutually exclusive. I think in fact, one informs the other. What matters most for me is the why and the how that's driving it. When I left Allegheny College 11 years ago to come and teach at St. Ignatius, it was really because I wanted to prepare young people for college. I had spent 9 years in higher ed, and in most of my work, my job was to mentor and support college faculty who were teaching writing in our first year seminar program and who were advising freshman students. And in that work, one of the most common frustrations that I heard from colleagues was this feeling that many of our college freshmen were really not prepared to learn independently, and that many of them wanted what colleagues would call kind of hand-holding. There was a sense of a sharp divide between the students who were really prepared for the rigors of college and the ones who were not. So when I came to St. Ignatius, I carried this context with me, and it caused me to be really tough on students. I set very high expectations and standards. I assigned a ton of work, and I expected my students to rise to the occasion. I would say when I started teaching here, I really expected my students to meet me where I was. I was relying on my experience. I knew what was coming for them in the next chapter. I knew what their college professors were expecting. I knew it was going to be tough. And so when I began teaching at the secondary level, I would say I really focused on rigor for rigor's sake. The work needed to be hard because the work would continue to be hard. And I felt I owed it to my students to prepare them for the realities of what I knew was coming around the corner. And this gave me a really strongly rooted sense of purpose. And I would say at that time, it led me to almost relentlessly pursue academic excellence from my students. Looking back, 11 years later, my commitment to excellence and my belief in the value of that rigor has definitely not faltered. I still believe high expectations are essential to our work, and I believe every single student I teach is capable of achieving excellence. But I would say everything else about how I approach the idea of rigor has evolved. How I create a culture of rigor has changed, but I would say even more importantly, why I do it has changed pretty dramatically. Sometimes it isn't a cannonball that changes our mindset and our vocation. Sometimes it's a series of these pebbles that pepper us with little wake-up calls that really change our perspective. And those are the moments that I see God inviting us to reconsider how we're encountering young people in our work. I will never forget one day early in my second year of teaching, when the bell rang to signal the start of third period. I was getting ready to start class with a group of seniors, and I see one boy sitting to the back of the room, just going to town on his lunch, like crumbs everywhere, total mess. And at this point in my career, I'm a newbie and I'm thinking, I got to make sure that I'm not messing around. I'm a total stickler for the rules, and we have no eating in class policy. So I walk back to this young man and I tell him to put his lunch away. And I've taught this boy the year before, so I knew him pretty well. Super affable kid, always happy, always in a great mood, super respectful and incredibly high achieving. This is a kid who's on the ball, model student. And I'm standing there waiting for him to put his food away. He bursts into tears. He steps out to compose himself. And when I go out to talk with him in the hall, he tells me through his tears, profusely apologetic, that he's taken a full load as a senior and he's lifting during his free period, 9-period day, and he doesn't have any free periods and has no time to eat. And I see in this moment a boy who is carrying seemingly so effortlessly and easily, trying to be perfect and trying to do it all. Later that semester, I remember same year having a conversation with another senior who at the time I assumed had a pretty serious case of senioritis. He was handing in super sloppy work and had what I had assumed was a really bad attitude. And I remember one day handing out a new essay assignment. I think it was probably the 4th assignment they'd had that year. And he got it, looked at it, and he promptly crumpled it up into a ball and shot a 3-pointer with it into the trash. And when the bell rang, I asked him where his next class was and asked if I could take a walk with him. And I said, hey, why'd you throw out that assignment? And he said, I hate writing. And he has this kind of severe look on his face, super tense, almost I'm thinking, is he mad at me? You know, but he was very, very tight and really kind of defensive. And by the end of that 5-minute walk across campus, after asking him why a few more times, I learned that this young man had never received higher than a D on any essay that he had written. And for that young man, what I initially perceived as lack of effort or maybe some senioritis was a defense mechanism, because he had lost his belief in his ability to succeed in an English classroom. All it takes is going on one Kairos retreat to know beyond a doubt that what we see in our students, from our students in the classroom, is often just the surface level behavior, reflecting an incredibly complex and complicated web of beliefs and values that are formed by their past experiences and current expectations. Every young person comes to us uniquely, and yet there is something that they all share. And for me, this is where I go when I think about what rigor should look like in our schools. Each and every one of our students comes to us as a child of God, gifted through his grace with immense capacity. Every one of them brings to our communities his or her own unique sets of God-given talents and capacity. So for me, rigor for the sake of rigor is very different from a rigor that enables students to cultivate and breathe life into their God-given gifts and capacities. Rigor that causes a young person in our classrooms to feel like they're not worthy or not capable, in my view, I would say has no place in our schools. Rigor that comes at the risk of a student's well-being is not a healthy tension, it's unhealthy. And I think Denise's presentation shared that so clearly. Like anything else in this life, rigor in and of itself is not good or bad. But for me, the shadow side of rigor comes out when we pursue it for its own sake. And as Kristin noted in her opening remarks, rigor and care are not necessarily mutually exclusive, but rigor simply for the sake of rigor can be damaging to the culture of care that we're called to cultivate. By contrast, I think rigor expressed and practiced as a culture of care can be incredibly powerful. On seminars in Ignatian leadership, I think it's not an accident that we begin the first week, the Loyola session, with this question of why. Participants are asked, why are you here? And the answer they're invited to contemplate is found in the first principle and foundation of the spiritual exercises. The first principle reminds us all things in life are gifts. All things are invitations that have the potential to deepen our relationship with God. The problem is when we allow those gifts to become attachments to the extent that they distract us from our real purpose. In teaching, we often talk about the value of decentering our classrooms. And I would argue that in Jesuit schools, our ability to achieve excellence that aligns with our mission actually requires not a decentering, but a recentering. And I think back on the teacher that I was 11 years ago, relentlessly pursuing academic rigor for the sake of academic rigor. How might my encounters with those young men have been different if I had recentered what I was asking them to do in a different why? In my experience, our students are much more likely to bring their fullest selves to an experience of rigor that's communicated as an invitation to grow into their God-given gifts and capacities. As educators, what a tremendous invitation that we have in the face of every single student that we teach. We have the privilege to help them discover, cultivate, and celebrate their gifts. This is what Magis looks like in the context of academic rigor. It's our responsibility to ask and answer honestly whether our practices of rigor are enabling or stifling that. Are we creating space in our work for the Holy Spirit to light up our students' gifts? Do our students know that we are working hard to challenge them so that they can live into those gifts? Is that what we lead with when we set high expectations? You know, rigor doesn't always have to look like those traditional versions of hard. When I think back to that young man bursting into tears in the hallway because he didn't have time to eat his lunch, I can now see a young man who was beating himself up to achieve an image of perfection he felt he wasn't living up to. And when I think back to the young man shooting 3-pointers with my essay assignment, I see a young man beating himself up because he thought he wasn't good enough to succeed or belong in my classroom. When we don't give ourselves grace, when we don't give ourselves our students that grace, we can have a skewed sense of what our expectations are. You know, the work that St. Ignatius has done with Challenge Success in the past really inspired us this year to take a closer look at student engagement. I love that she laid out those 3 components of success, and engagement was a piece of that. As part of our study, we interviewed focus groups of students with the goal of learning more about what really helps them to engage in meaningful, rigorous learning. And over, our students affirmed the fundamental role of relational components of learning. Students emphasize the power that a passionate, loving teacher has to inspire students to show up more fully. They also emphasize the value of teachers who challenge them. When Father Powell was talking about the alumni who come back and talk about those teachers that really transformed them, our students spoke to that same exact thing, but they did it for the teachers who had done that work for them in a particular way. When I reflect on the stories our students shared about the teachers who have really made a difference in their lives, it strikes me that I heard 2 resounding messages in their experiences. Teachers who pile on work for no clear reason or purpose, or who seem to expect rigor for rigor's sake, can create a good deal of stress and even alienate students from what I would say is meaningful learning. But I think when teachers challenge students purposely and explicitly because they love and respect them and believe deeply in their capacity and gifts, students won't just achieve the rigor. They build a culture of care that foregrounds a love of learning and respect for the dignity of each person. And that's what I believe we're really called to do. So as I reflect on the comments from earlier this afternoon, I feel inspired and kind of reified in the mission that we have as Jesuit schools. My principal shared some feedback with me on this talk, and one of the things that he reminded me is that our schools have missions, but our mission has schools. And so I'm thinking about how do we carry that forward, this mantra of how I emphasize my students' gifts first and foremost, how I take an asset-driven approach to rigor has really helped me reframe my own expectations of what rigor looks like and to cultivate a kind of rigor that better serves our students and our mission. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Terra, and thank you for your willingness to share your reflections and your own evolution of professional growth around this conversation. It's really terrific to hear kind of the personal reflections, but the idea of rigor as, I believe you said, cultivating life as an invitation to grow. And then also about the shadow side of rigor. And I think your remarks will touch deeply and probably connect deeply to the folks around the network who are working directly with kids and who are taking this kind of big, heady conversation in the practical way, and working with students sitting in front of them through all the anecdotes that you shared that we got to hear. So thank you so much. And to offer our concluding session, and I am aware for those of us live here that we are running a little bit behind time, all for good and wonderful reasons, of course, for our content here. But to offer our concluding session, before we open up for some time for dialogue, it's my pleasure to welcome Michelle Nevin Levine, who serves as principal of St. Ignatius College Preparatory in San Francisco, California. She has served on staff at St. Ignatius College Prep since earning her MA in Educational Psychology from the University of San Francisco in 1995. In her 28 years at SI, she has been a college counselor, a personal and academic counselor, the director of counseling, and the dean of students. Driven by her passion for student mental health, Michelle was instrumental in designing and implementing SI's wellness program in 2010 and was the school's crisis response team leader for 13 years. She is now serving in her 4th year as SI's principal. She will share this afternoon her insights from a principal's perspective. How do we effectively balance academic rigor with changing student needs in Jesuit schools today? Michelle.
Thank you so much, Kristin. Thank you to all of the speakers. This has been such a rich experience for me, and I've learned a lot already. I just want to talk a little bit, and I'll be conscious of time. I know that we're running over. I want to talk a little bit about what has led me to this place, where I have become a Jesuit school principal whose main focus is student mental health. And again, that's not my only focus, but it's definitely the main focus and the lens through which I look through first when having conversations about programs at our schools and certainly academics and co-curriculars. I came to SI 28 years ago, not thinking that, that this was going to be my permanent job. But the first thing that happened to me that I know has happened to many of you is that I fell in love with students. I fell in love with teenagers, most especially. I love the way their minds work, particularly during those adolescent years when kids can be really indignant and upset 1 hour of the day, and then passionate and creative and uplifted the next hour of the day, and that those experiences for them are very authentic. And that was really appealing to me. And then secondly, I fell in love with Jesuit education. The idea that the Jesuits seek to educate young leaders who are going to go out into the world and have a positive impact, that they're going to respond or be asked and expected to respond courageously to the challenges of our time was just incredible. So I fell in love with teenagers and then Jesuit education. At that time, when I first came to the school, I was working as a counselor, and we used to say commonly, even as counselors, that this is not a mental health institution. Okay, so when dealing with students who were struggling with anxiety, depression, or any other mental health disorder, we would make reference to the fact that we refer and that we don't take full responsibility for the care of our students, in that we're a school primarily, and education is our main focus, but we're not a mental health institution. Well, as you all know, that's changed quite a bit over time. And we've come to learn that the students cannot access their education when they're anxious and they're depressed. So for us at SI, we were jolted into reality that we must respond courageously to the mental health crisis. And not just the mental health crisis that took place during the pandemic or after the pandemic, but prior to it. And we were jolted into that reality because we lost, between the years of 2009 and 2012, we lost 4 students to suicide. It was a really dark and depressing time in our history. But it catapulted us into real action. We took a deep dive and we started to talk to experts at UCSF and Stanford. We partnered really quickly with Challenge Success, and we began to embrace the fact that our students really need us to take a look at ourselves and how we may be contributing to the crisis. I'm not saying that we were certainly not causing suicide or causing depression or anxiety necessarily, but that we needed to take more of a responsibility and look at ourselves, ask questions about how we might be contributing. So we know what kids face, things that kids face that we did not when we were in high school, or at least most of us did not. So social media, competition to get into college, building of their resumes, scary news stories, school shootings, climate change, politics, racial reckoning, all of these things. And we noticed that our school and the students in our school started to feel like they were inside of a pressure cooker. We knew that there was something that we had to do about it. There was a time, and I know that many other principals of Jesuit schools who I've spoken to will say the same thing, that there was a time where we would brag about the grind, or we would brag about rigor, as it was traditionally defined in our schools. And what does rigor mean? We've already talked about this, but if you look at the definition, it's strict, inflexible, perfectionistic, rigid, and that's not what we want. And I think we all agree upon that. It's not what we want, and it's not what Ignatius wanted for us or for our students. It's certainly not what he would want if he were here with us today. So it is our responsibility to see the mental health crisis as our call to re-envision student life from all angles, not just from a counseling perspective. And this, in my opinion, is the challenge of our time. So again, I mentioned that we started to reach out to local experts who were really incredibly helpful to us in order to build a wellness program, a really comprehensive wellness program at our school, and we partnered with Challenge Success. Challenge Success, nod to Denise Pope and her colleagues, really helped us to change our culture quite a bit. We looked at our schedule first and made some really positive changes initially, and have just finally instituted a late start for our school. I'm so happy to say that. It took us a long time because change is slow in schools, but we now have a 9 o'clock start across the board. And our students and families are really noticing a difference. And then, of course, we started talking about homework load. The pandemic helped a lot with this because teachers were really forced to look at what they were assigning and how they were assessing students and make some changes that fit the needs of that time. And then we started to use the Challenge Success surveys, which I highly recommend, so that we could take a temperature of what was going on in our schools, how our kids were feeling, whether or not they were experiencing a true sense of belonging at our school, which we know is an incredible protective factor. So what did it say? What did the surveys say? Well, one of the things that the surveys said is that our students' main source of stress is schoolwork. What do they worry about the most? School responsibilities. And that can be expected to a certain extent, right? School is challenging, and it should be. But we really need to listen and hear from our students because, as I've said, and we've all said, life is pretty different for a modern teenager than it was for most of us. And it's imperative that we listen. We often ask our students to answer this question. What do you wish your teacher knew? Just one question. We ask them to answer that. And over, the theme is they say something like, I wish my teachers knew that I care about their class, but it's not my only responsibility. It's not my only responsibility. People get nervous when we talk about minimizing homework or even redefining rigor. And why is that? Because we're a Jesuit school and we have incredible teachers, we have incredible educators, and they know what they're doing. I really believe in the work that they do with our kids. So we need to listen to them too. We're known for pushing our kids to achieve at a high level. That's not necessarily a bad thing because we want them to be leaders. We want them to be serious in their desire to rise up to the challenges of our time. That's what we need in our world. And students should be challenged. When kids are in class and they're struggling to work through a problem, they're working hard with the support of their peers and their teacher, either individually or collectively, to figure it out, and that light bulb goes off. That's awesome. That's exactly what we want. Believing in your own ability to think critically and work through problems is huge, and it's a huge protective factor for our kids, so we want that. But I would argue that they should do the majority of the really hard work in that environment, in that classroom environment, and time should be given back to them at home whenever possible, to rest, to rejuvenate, to have fun, and to sleep. One thing that I thought was really promising, if you've looked at the latest CDC report that came out, they talk about school connectedness for the first time and its impact on mental health. I was so happy to see that. So the CDC research shows that youth who reported feeling more connected at school during COVID-19 were less likely to report poor mental health, even when they were going to school virtually. School connectedness has long-lasting effects on health and well-being. So the CDC says youth who feel connected at school are significantly less likely to experience health risks related to sexual health, substance abuse, violence, and mental health into adulthood. And what does connection look like at our schools right now? Lynn Lyons, she was one of the psychotherapists that Denise Pope referenced. She'll be speaking in a couple of days, I believe, along with Denise Pope and Challenge Success. She's got a podcast, and she talks about some recent research, and it shows that positive experiences counteract negative childhood experiences. So what I mean is that adults who have hardships in childhood have better mental health in adulthood if their negative experiences are at least matched with positive experiences throughout their childhood. Now that's really promising, because we know we can't help our students to avoid all negative experiences. And in fact, we really shouldn't, right? Because avoidance is actually the enemy of anxiety. We don't want to help children avoid hardships. They need to practice coping skills throughout their lives. But this research shows that adding joyful, fun, positive experiences really helps. And we're seeing that at SI. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. We did not solve the pandemic, but we did everything we could to promote healthy interactions during that time. We fought to continue our athletic programs, masks, and outdoors, just for fun, for activity and connection and fun. And when they returned to campus, we threw a prom in the fall and in the spring, just to provide more opportunities for students to get excited, to plan, to laugh, and to dance. And those things really helped. Empowering kids, listening to kids is really important. And I suggest that you really listen in new ways that we haven't before. So when they ask to do crazy things, like put a skating rink on the roof for the Christmas party, try to meet the need in some way. Say, okay, we can't have the rink on the roof, but we can put one in the courtyard. Let's talk about how we can make that work. Let's try and make it happen. When they want to have a pie eating contest at recess, and I absolutely love that the Jesuits introduced recess. I'm going to be telling everyone that the Jesuits introduced recess. When they want to have a pie eating contest, you hate that, right? I don't, that's not my favorite thing. I think it's disgusting. I think it's a waste of food. It's messy, etc. But they really want to do it. So maybe you allow it, but it's outside, you put some parameters on it, and you make it palatable. Take some risks. We've done some things, some new and exciting things just from listening to our kids. Our kids at one point asked if we could have a local rapper who was on the rise come to school and do a concert. And we were not crazy about that idea at first, but we took a risk and we reached out to this young gentleman who was lovely. And we talked to him about the possibility of coming to campus and having a concert for our kids. We explained what we were trying to achieve in terms of engagement, wanting our kids to be at school as often as they could, having a good time, feeling proud of their school, connected, and a sense of belonging. And he agreed to come. and put on a concert without swearing. If you can believe that, it actually happened and it was a blast. So we're learning to take some more risks on behalf of our kids and offer them experiences that counteract some of the negative experiences that they have, particularly the negative experiences around the pandemic. We know that we can help, not just by making sure that our counseling programs are above average, which I think is really, really important. They need to have expertise and an ability to offer direct support to our students who are struggling. That's important. But we look at every area of the school through the mental health lens, and we build up protective factors everywhere we can through fun and connection. I'm just going to throw out a couple other ideas. I'm going to stop short because I know we're really short on time. It's very, very important that we continue to keep our students engaged in conversations about God. So our campus ministry and religious studies teachers are excellent at this during a time in students' lives where they tend to take a step back from their faith and they question it. We want them to stay engaged and connected to conversations around God, and hopefully developing a connection with the campus ministers and religious studies teachers while they're having those conversations. In co-curriculars, we're providing opportunities to find their passions and to have fun. We're bringing in a speaker tonight, for example. We're bringing in a speaker to talk to our coaches about mental health for our athletes. That's really important. In the area of diversity, equity, and inclusion and belonging, I don't think that you can talk about DEI initiatives at all without talking about mental health. And I don't think you can talk about mental health without talking about DEIB. Providing affinity spaces for our students so that they have places to go and people to spend time with who they truly connect with and they share context with has been really important. In academics, we want them to be challenged, as I said, but also fully supported and not overwhelmed or drowning in homework. We have a new SEL curriculum that's instituted for every single one of our freshmen. We teach mindfulness to every single freshman in either their first semester or second semester of freshman year. That's been incredibly helpful and uplifting. There's no area of the school that cannot be touched. In discipline, we use restorative justice. So knowing that consequences are really important for our students, but it's also equally as important that we restore the relationships that were damaged when things go wrong. And then we look at things as simple as just looking at food and our food services and how do we support kids when they're struggling, looking to, serve their favorite meals during exam times. We offer snacks and we give them a voice to talk about what kind of food they'd like to eat. That seems silly, but kids feel really cared for. And our kids who are gluten-free or who have sensitivities or allergies, that they know that they're being heard and supported at school is really important to them. And we're finding results for this. Mostly, we just want our kids to have events to look forward to, safe, fun events where they feel connected and a full sense of belonging, and again, pride in their school. I like to talk about what I want for students all the time as a principal, and I ask my staff to do the same, just normalizing talking about emotions and mental health and modeling, apologizing when you make a mistake, as opposed to making an attempt to be perfectionistic, looking for opportunities to reward kids who care for themselves, right? A change in our mental health leave policies, allowing for kids to leave school if they need extra treatment or help and support, and then offering them a spot to come back and even to graduate from our school. We give awards out at the end of the year, and award ceremonies can be somewhat problematic at times. We work with Challenge Success on how to structure those award ceremonies, but we offer awards to students who are engaged in taking care of their own mental health needs and then coming back to school and supporting other students and initiatives around destigmatizing mental health, et cetera. So there's lots of ideas, lots of things I could talk about. And I'm going to cut myself off. I have actually too much, but I want to invite you, if any one of you feels like you want to reach out and have a conversation with me, I love that. I learn something from every Ignatian educator that I have the privilege of speaking with, including the speakers today. So I just thank you for your time. And Kristin, thank you for inviting me to be a part of this.
Thank you so much, Michelle. You know, I think I will hear your words echoed long after we are finished with this symposium, that this is the challenge of our time. And listening to you, you made a very, you offered a very practical kind of to-do list of how we can animate, how we can bring to life these larger ideas in our schools. So I thank you for the generosity of sharing that, and also your thoughts that no corner, there is no corner of the school that cannot be touched by this conversation. So it really is a tremendous urging, as you said, or catapulting, as you said, for all of us into action. So thank you for that. We'll transition now, again, being very mindful of time. My colleague, Kristin Smith, I think will pull up our panelists here on the screen. We'll transition to a brief dialogue portion here, some time for a little bit of Q&A and kind of debriefing. And to the participants here that are on the symposium call, in addition to specific questions you might have that I'd urge you to pop into the chat window, I'd encourage you to just reflect on a few prompts for consideration. As you listened to our 6 panelists, what did you connect to? Where did you feel hope? What moved you? On the other hand, where did you feel frustrated? Where did you feel tension, or where did you feel struggle? I think it's important to pay attention to that. And I think I'll begin here by just asking our panelists to share a little bit, having heard the full lot here, what's on your mind? What are your reactions and reflections?
I see a great question in the chat. Is it okay to jump on that? Yeah, so Alyssa said, what are some additional practical pieces of advice you might offer to teachers who struggle with what rigor should look like? You know, if you've been teaching for a little while, I think even in my first year, when I really didn't know what the heck I was doing, I could look out into the room and I could see in the eyes of the kids, and I could see in their energy what kind of engagement they had. When Denise talked about behavioral engagement doing school, there's a kind of robotic going through the motions. You know, sometimes a student can look really engaged and beneath the surface, they're not. A colleague of mine was doing an observation and was just sharing a story about seeing a student kind of ask a question and raise his hand. And from the teacher's perspective, it probably looked like he was engaged, but from behind, he could see he was like playing a game on his laptop. And so there's always this question, what we're seeing from kids, is it really what's there? You can see when you walk past a classroom, you walk past a colleague's classroom, and there is a chaotic activeness to that room. There's a buzz to it. There is a love that's alive in how students are showing up. So this question, what are some additional practical pieces of advice that you offer about what rigor should look like? For me, it's, are they engaged with a purpose that is clearly articulated? So it's easy to get kids buzzing around, you know, like a Kahoot or a fun game in class. And that's an easy way to kind of get them jazzed up and break up what feels like the monotony of the day, or just give them an opportunity for joy. For me, the academic rigor component comes in when they're experiencing that fun in an activity that's directed toward their learning in really direct and explicit ways. I'll just quiet down and let others jump in here, because I think I'm dominating and we don't have a lot of time. But I feel like as a teacher, if you're constantly reading the room and you're trying to think of ways to get the kids excited about what they're doing, that's the first step, because they might go through the motions of rigor if you ask first for rigor. But if you start with a love of learning, for me, the rigor is a natural next step that's going to follow.
And I would just share that college can be fun in the classroom. And I think it's important to build that expectation in high school, that it's not all just about academic rigor and scary, large tomes of volumes of reading that we have to do in complex problems. I have plenty of faculty members who do just such fun things with their class. We have someone who does the history of hip hop here in the Bronx and brings in speakers and performers and artists, and students are loving that learning. Or when we take students out to museums and say, go experience that art. And yes, Dr. Nason, and go and have a great time in the city and explore and learn. So I think that that's an expectation that we can set and encourage. So I just want to amplify that.
Michelle, I might ask you to take a next question posed from Brad, who I appreciate very much. How do you balance this new understanding of rigor with courses that have external assessments like APs, for example? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'll give you my thoughts on it. We have had conversations on and off over the years around our AP program. And it really goes against, as a lot of you might agree, like sort of some of our Jesuit philosophy around you don't like to teach to a test, especially an external test necessarily. Yet, those are some really challenging courses that our kids love and get a lot out of. What we're struggling with as an institution is whether or not our kids are actually benefiting by taking those AP courses compared to schools who are in our area who are no longer offering AP courses anymore. I'm curious about that in terms of how colleges look at it. I heard everything that you said about the school profile. I totally understand that, and I agree. The school profile is really important. If our students they're all taking college prep classes, right? If we stopped offering AP, for example, what would that look like if our students are being compared to schools that do offer APs? That's one question that I would have, and I'm not sure of the answer to that, but it's something that we're discussing and that's worth discussing. And if we're going to keep our AP program, another current conversation that we're having is, are we going to require that every student take the AP test? Is that going to continue to be important to us as we see our teachers really stressing about their past, right? And kind of competing, and it's really hard on them when colleges often do not accept an AP score, as it doesn't really work to their benefit in college in terms of getting rid of a requirement in their first year. So I don't have an answer for you around that, just to say that we're discussing it all the time. It's actually one of the main topics in a debriefing meeting that we have coming up at the end of the year.
And I can't speak for maybe the most super selective colleges, but there's 4,500 of us that have acceptance rates that are not 10% or 5%. So, where many of our students are going and are being successful and are having wonderful experiences. And even the super selective colleges, I think, would agree with this. If a school doesn't offer something, we can't expect a student to achieve at it. It's what is being offered in the context of that school. So there have been schools that have moved away from AP curriculum. Maybe they've moved to the IB curriculum because they want critical theory of knowledge and writing and research as part of their curriculum, as opposed to what AP offers. Or they've moved strictly to college level courses, or you have some states where dual enrollment is the thing that signals rigor. So I think if that's an important conversation to your community, it's just, what are you going to replace that with, and how will then you demonstrate that in a way to us that we would understand? And I struggle very personally with the idea of an AP course and the AP exam. I don't necessarily see the results of AP exams till students send them to us once they're enrolled in July. But if you had a 70 in the AP course and you weren't engaged in it, but you got a 5 on the test, I'm more concerned about the 70 that you got in the AP course, which tells me you weren't engaged in the classroom. You could absolutely do the work, you had it innately in you. But to me, that's almost like what we see in testing, right? You have a 1500, but a 2.9 GPA. Why is that? That's more important to us, I think, is what's happening in the classroom. So you will get pushback, right? Because there's this concern of this competitive furor that we're all in. And I don't have the answer for that, other than if we all keep trying to break the cycle, maybe we can break it.
There are so many thoughtful comments and reflections for those of us that are here live in the chat window, and I'm afraid we're not going to get to all of them, but to just prompt them for further conversation, what we hope will come from the symposium. So we have terrific questions on how we as educators who are often driven, high-achieving individuals, how do we kind of model these conversations of balancing rigor and care in our own lives? Is a terrific point. Another question about differing levels of student rigor within schools. How do you create a uniformity amongst those different levels of kids and academic learning? And then how do we, as the adults in communities, signal and model to students about being countercultural when it comes to social media and it comes to crafting space for silence. So there is so much more to say, but in the interest of time, and I want to be respectful to Cristiano's opening thoughts, I keep thinking of the early Jesuits and their 2 hours of sitting down and their half-hour recess. So I should formally begin to conclude here just by offering a couple moments of wrap up here. So why don't I do that? Academic rigor in Jesuit education, there really is so much to say that we could go on and on. But as we conclude, I will first offer my thanks to our panelists who have so graciously shared their work and their time and their learning and energy with all of us this afternoon. It's not an easy thing to do, as we know, in the midst of very full plates of these remarkable educational leaders. I look forward to sharing the symposium recording within a few days on our JSN website and via our social media platforms. So please stay tuned for this. And you are most welcomed and really encouraged to share widely the link within your own communities. Help us to get word out about the powerful conversations that we shared today. I think the value of digging into this learning in our schools cannot be underestimated. And I urge us all to consider, to continue to find ways to do so within our own communities. To those that joined us this afternoon, or are watching recorded, we thank you as well for your time and engagement. I'll conclude by asking that all of us consider how can we best follow up and learn from what we spoke about today. We might all ask ourselves, when we think of the changing dynamics of academic rigor in Jesuit education, what comes next? What more can we all do to support this conversation, ultimately to support students in these unusual days? Our hope is that we have left you with a lot to think about by providing a language to describe some of the challenges we face in making sense of our own journey as educators. Each of us can and should feel empowered to live the mission of our schools as we navigate through the complexities of the day-to-day. One tangible focus that comes next is our latest JSN pop-up survey on this topic of academic rigor. The survey has been shared with principals and presidents around the network who have been asked to share the survey with their communities. So our hope is that it will provide an informative snapshot data on this conversation that will be useful to school communities as we near the end of this school year. It's open for one more week, and I encourage you to contribute your insights and help to make the learning that we glean from that pop-up survey even more powerful, especially after the conversations we enjoyed this afternoon. I look forward to sharing all of that follow-up data with you in just about a month's time. And finally, on a programmatic level, I will note that we aim to offer virtual symposia in the future, again, on topics of timely relevance to our schools. Listening to schools and responding to them is our way of proceeding at the JSN. Part of the idea is that we are staying in tune to the landscape of issues that are of value to schools and the educators in them. So please stay tuned for more. We aim to reach every Ignatian educator in the schools, and we are hopeful that these virtual symposia it will be one step along the path of that goal. So thank you for being a part of the Jesuit School Network's Spring 2023 Ignatian Inquiry After School Symposium. We appreciate your time.